Tormund Giantsbane leaned against the crude wooden railing of a half-collapsed watchtower, gazing out at the ragged host of his folk. The skies above them were a slate gray, caught between day and night, and the biting cold that had once been so familiar to him in the far north now seemed almost gentler, dulled by the southern warmth even in the heart of winter. Once crossing the wall had been a dream, a myth, but the wall had fallen in the war against the dead, and here he stood, well past the remnants of that towering ice barrier, well into territories that had once been forbidden to men like him. He turned his gaze southward, toward a horizon he had never really thought he would see with his own eyes. The Westerlands, or at least the fringes of it, beckoned across a vast span of foothills and rugged farmland. Old Tormund's heart beat with the thrill of it. It had been many moons since the armies of the living triumphed over the White Walkers and their undead hordes. Tormund had joined Jon Snow, the Starks, and all the great houses of the South in that great struggle. He had witnessed the living hold their breath while the army of the dead threatened to snuff all life out of the world. He had swung his axe and bellowed his war cries alongside men who once might have run him through simply for being a wildling. He had lost friends, kin, and even his sense of the future in that war. But once that existential threat was gone, the South had turned again to its old games of power and vengeance. Tormund, reluctant to play that game, had returned north of the ruins of the wall with the free folk who survived. And yet here he was venturing south again. This time, it was not some ill-fated alliance or existential crisis that pulled him forward. It was hunger, or more precisely, it was the future of his people. Even with the White Walkers gone, life in the far north remained harsher than ever. The war for the dawn had turned much of the land into a frozen wasteland. Game was scarce, the ground itself had cracked. Winter might recede in the warmer, more fertile southern lands, but in the true north it lingered longer. Crops had failed, and many among Tormund's people had faced famine. The promise of a new life in the gift, lands once promised by the Starks, had turned bitter after the devastation left behind by the undead, the old feuds between the watchmen who remained and some unscrupulous northern lords, and the simple lack of supplies to feed them all. The free folk were proud, but they were neither blind nor stupid. They could not survive forever in scorched land. So Tormund listened to the complaints of his people. He heard the stories of a half-dozen raids south of what used to be the wall, and the violent reprisals that followed from northerners who had not forgotten their old prejudices. Wildlings or not, many good men and women had fought and died for the realm, yet old grievances died hard. The smaller enclaves of free folk began to trickle away. They needed land to settle that wasn't constantly contested, that wasn't racked by old hatreds. Some believed going west, away from the north, might afford them new chances. Certainly, the Westerlands were wealthy and rich in farmland and gold. Might Tormund's people carve out a piece for themselves? At first, Tormund resisted the notion of a mass migration. But each day he saw more children going to sleep hungry. He saw that the so-called freed folk would be as good as thralls if they begged too long in the north. He still trusted Jon Snow, who had tried, in his own honorable way, to help them. But the new king in the north, or warden, or whatever the southern lords were naming him now, was not as free as he wanted to be. Jon had responsibilities to the other houses, to Sansa, to the lords who demanded taxes and land. Tormund realized that relying solely on northern charity was a losing proposition. This was not a matter of loyalty or friendship. It was survival. In time, a plan took shape, to lead his people west, to seize a swath of that famed Lannister land where they might farm, hunt, and build a new home. He counted on the Westerlands being weaker than before, still recovering from the wars that had racked the Seven Kingdoms. He knew that would likely lead to bloodshed, but Tormund decided it was better to fight openly, with steel in hand and straightforward cause, than to starve quietly. He rallied his kin, spread word among the scattered free folk that they were marching for new territory. Some turned away, calling him mad for going so far into the south. Others, desperate or simply enthralled by Tormund's presence, followed willingly. And so, a ramshackle host of thousands now gathered, forging their own roads over the rough countryside. From the watchtower, Tormund's bright blue eyes squinted at the southern horizon. They had clashed with a few small Lannister patrols, but nothing too large yet. The Westerlands stood waiting, with all its potential and all its danger. Tormund rested a hand on the large steel pommel of his sword. Winter's bite might have softened here, but he knew better than to let his guard down. With a final grunt, he turned away from the horizon and climbed down the winding steps. It was time to move again. He could almost smell farmland in the distance. Far to the south, in the city of Casterly Rock, Queen Cersei Lannister paced the length of a corridor draped in crimson and gold tapestries, her every footstep echoing off cold stone walls. The war against the dead had forced alliances she despised, and she had taken desperate gambles to preserve her house. The battles had left her armies depleted, so she had had to consolidate her power. And yet, even after the threat of the White Walkers was gone, she had to keep an iron grip on her realm. She had lost King's Landing. She had lost her Iron Throne to the swirl of new leadership in the realm, but she clung to the Westerlands with the fervor of a cornered lioness. Tyrion had proven too clever, Jaime too conflicted, so she had retreated to the seat of her ancestors, trying to secure it, trying to outlive all threats. Each day that the coffers of the Rock seemed emptier, each day that her list of allies grew shorter, she plotted a way to regain the advantage. Word had reached her about the wildlings on the move. Ridiculous, she had first thought. Nothing but rumors. Tormund Giantsbane, that big, loud savage, was not a threat. But the rumors persisted, carried by frightened peasants fleeing burned-out farms in the northern fringes of the Westerlands. The free folk, they said, roamed in the hundreds, even thousands, sacking small villages and claiming land for their own. Cersei recognized the danger. She might still have one of the largest armies among the Seven Kingdoms, but her men were stretched thin, guarding the borders, collecting taxes, quelling restlessness among her own vassals. With time, she might gather a force large enough to crush these wildlings, but a direct confrontation on open ground was expensive, especially while the gold mines of the Westerlands were no longer producing at the rate they once had. She remembered the tension between the Lannisters and the North, how Sansa Stark sat at Winterfell, how the realm had become a patchwork of alliances. If Cersei needed more resources, if she needed allies, she might have to swallow her pride and negotiate. But with whom? The name Jon Snow floated through her mind. Once upon a time, she had promised to send troops to help in the fight against the dead. A promise she broke. That man had tried to hold her to her word, and she had turned her back on him, believing that once the White Walkers were done with the North, she could mop up the remainder. But the living had survived. Jon Snow, that brooding upstart, had been declared king, then abdicated or changed his title to Warden. Or so the stories said. Sansa Stark, the little bird turned wolf, held more real power in Winterfell than any queen in the North might have had in centuries. Would the Starks ever ally with her again? Cersei doubted it, but maybe desperation made for strange bedfellows. When the news of entire Lannister patrols vanishing reached Casterly Rock, Cersei convened her lords in a solemn council. They debated strategies. Some called for a swift purge, for raising the banners of every Lannister vassal to ride north and burn the wildlings out. Others counseled caution, pointing out that the realm was still recovering. One old knight suggested opening negotiations with the free folk, promising them some small tract of land in exchange for service. Cersei found that distasteful. She had no interest in trusting barbarians. But she could not dismiss the fact that her army might be overextended if she tried to fight them all at once. In the corner of the council, a balding maester cleared his throat. He timidly pointed out that the best solution to a threat from the North might be, like it or not, an alliance with the North itself. For all the enmity between Lannister and Stark, a threat from Tormund's host could be addressed if the North was persuaded to keep their own region under control or to intervene. After all, the wildlings answered to no southern authority, but they had once followed Jon Snow's leadership. If an agreement were reached, maybe Tormund could be convinced to stand down, or the Starks might help subdue him in return for some concessions. Cersei's eyes narrowed at the suggestion, but she did not dismiss it. Even a lion might stoop to unseemly pacts if the alternative was ruin. Meanwhile, Tormund's wildling host advanced in fits and starts. They did not move like a well-ordered southern army, with supply lines and baggage trains. They lived off the land, raiding small homesteads or negotiating with frightened farmers who discovered that these so-called savages could sometimes be reasoned with if they were treated fairly. But not every encounter ended peacefully. Bands of Lannister soldiers met them on the edges of farmland. Steel clashed. Tormund was forced to marshal his warriors in a more organized fashion. But he had cunning lieutenants at his side, leaders from various clans that had long dwelled beyond the wall. They understood ambushes, they understood how to draw the fight into terrain that benefited them. Soon enough, the Lannister garrisons were overwhelmed in pockets, forced to retreat. News traveled slowly, but panic traveled quickly. The peasantry started to flee inland, some heading for the safety of larger towns or seeking protection at the gates of Lannister castles. Tormund had not intended to cause widespread terror. He wanted land, not endless slaughter. But war is rarely so precise, and the fear of the unknown guided many. He pressed onward, carving a line through the hills and valleys, his people settling in behind him wherever they found a safe place to rest. They built rudimentary walls around captured farms and tried to make them their own. Tormund expected the Lannisters to come in force, but it seemed they were slow to respond. That worried him more than he admitted. Something was brewing, he thought. The Lannisters always had a trick. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark listened with growing concern to the reports from the western roads. Refugees from the Westerlands, poor, huddled folk, came to the north, claiming they'd been burnt out of their homes by wildlings. Sansa frowned. On one hand, Tormund Giantsbane was a friend to Jon Snow, one of the heroes who helped hold the line against the White Walkers. But these attacks on southern folk put the north in a precarious position. If the Westerlands were truly threatened, then House Stark might be called upon to intervene or at least explain why Tormund was free to roam. They had no direct authority over him, but that didn't matter to southern lords who would prefer to blame the north. She realized it could spark a new war. The north had bled too much already to risk being pulled into another bloody conflict. So she summoned her advisors. Jon Snow was no longer always by her side. He traveled between the north and the Targaryen-ruled Crownlands, apparently fostering a tenuous peace. Yet Sansa remained de facto leader in Winterfell, at times more commanding than her brother. She listened intently to the knights and lords who voiced concern over Tormund's rampage. Some demanded that the north disavow him publicly. Others pointed out that Tormund was only doing what any northerner would do if their families were starving: seek better land by force if no other means were offered. Sansa felt torn. If she remained passive, the rest of the realm might accuse her of letting an ally terrorize the West. If she intervened, she might end up going to war against Tormund, a man who had once fought for her family and for all living things. To complicate matters, a raven arrived from Casterly Rock. The letter, sealed with the Golden Lion sigil, carried a message from Cersei Lannister herself. In surprisingly measured tones, Cersei wrote that the wildling incursion threatened to destabilize the realm. She expressed hope that the North would maintain order by dealing with Tormund's host. Failing that, the Lannisters would be forced to muster a large army, potentially marching through the Riverlands or even the Neck, if that was what it took to eradicate the savage threat once and for all. The letter ended with a subtle but potent threat. The entire realm would see how the North responded, and alliances would be forged or broken based on that response. Sansa closed her eyes after reading the letter. She could nearly hear Cersei's sneering voice behind the parchment. The nerve of that woman, to pretend that the Lannisters were not themselves responsible for half the misery in the realm. And yet, Sansa was no longer the naive girl who had once arrived at King's Landing. She understood that sometimes you had to dance with devils to keep your people safe. If war was coming, better to shape it than be shaped by it. She called upon Brienne of Tarth, who had become her loyal protector and confidant. Sansa asked her to deliver a message to Tormund if at all possible. Brienne, though she had little love for the wildling's brash manner, agreed. The message was simple. The North could not openly support an invasion of the Westerlands, nor could it abide Tormund's host sacking villages. If Tormund wished to keep some measure of goodwill with the North, he must restrain his people from needless violence and open a channel for negotiation. Otherwise, Sansa might have to side with the Lannisters to avoid a greater war. Word traveled slowly, but eventually reached Tormund through the chain of free folk scouts and some northern rangers who still patrolled the area. Tormund read Sansa's letter, though in truth, someone read it to him, since his literacy was limited to a few scratchy runes. He scowled, then laughed, then scowled again. He muttered that he understood the predicament, but that the free folk wouldn't just turn around to starve. He respected Sansa well enough, but he wouldn't be dictated to. Still, he found himself pacing restlessly in their makeshift camp after the letter. He had no desire to drag Jon Snow or the North into conflict. But his people came first. At the same time, the Lannisters began to escalate. Small squads of cavalry harried Tormund's rearguard, burning supply wagons the wildlings had seized. Tormund's people weren't used to this style of open warfare. They could handle themselves in a fight, but they lacked big siege engines or lines of heavily armored knights. Their advantage lay in numbers, ferocity, and unorthodox tactics. They were unstoppable in a skirmish, but if the Lannisters decided to bring the full weight of a disciplined army upon them, Tormund feared the result. He convened with his clan leaders by a dim firelight in a looted barn. The roof leaked, and a steady drizzle peppered the gathering. Mud caked their boots and furs. Torchlight cast flickering shadows across their rugged faces. Some leaders argued to push further into the Westerlands, seizing a castle for themselves, a strong position from which to bargain. Others insisted they should parley with the Lannisters directly, ask for formal recognition of their right to settle. Tormund had no illusions about how well that would go. The Lannisters were never known for generosity. The debate grew heated, with raised voices echoing in the musty air. In the midst of this debate, a rider was spotted approaching. Tormund stepped outside into the drizzle, squinting through the darkness. It was Brienne of Tarth, arriving alone with a single torch. The towering woman in shining mail dismounted, eyes wary as she confronted the throng of wildlings. Many recognized her from the war or from Winterfell, and parted to let her pass. Tormund, remembering the big woman from the feast at Winterfell, gave a broad grin. He had once tried to flirt with her in his way, receiving only stoic indifference in return. But he respected her skill and her honor. Brienne delivered her message in person, a more elaborate plea than the letter's short text. She urged Tormund to withdraw or at least cease his raids until a diplomatic solution could be found. She reminded him of the goodwill the North had once shown. She assured him that Sansa was prepared to negotiate for farmland in the gift or even a portion of the neck if that was more fertile. Tormund listened, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He told her that he would consider it, but that he was not sure trust in the North would be enough. The free folk were tired of broken promises. They had been promised land before, but somehow it was always snatched away. Brienne, setting aside her usual reserve, explained the precarious political situation. If Tormund continued his invasion, the Lannisters would have every excuse to launch a devastating counterstrike, and might even gain sympathy from the other lords of Westeros if they framed this as a barbarian threat. The North would be pressured to join that fight or be declared complicit. Tormund spat, cursing Southern politics for the 100th time. He was stuck in a trap. Relenting meant letting his folk starve. Pressing forward meant a war that could cost them everything. But Tormund was no fool. For all his bravado, he recognized that Sansa's words were sincere. Moreover, he knew that if there was one person who might have the ear of the free folk other than himself, it was Jon Snow. If Jon could be convinced to vouch for them again, perhaps they could secure land near the outskirts of the North. Not too close to the hateful lords, but close enough that at least the Starks' protection might keep southern armies away. The question was, would the Lannisters give them a small corner of the Westerlands instead? Tormund stared into the smoldering remains of his campfire, picturing a life for his people that didn't involve constant flight or violence. He told Brienne to return to Winterfell with a response. He would pause major offensives for one moon's turn, provided the Lannisters also pulled back their raids. In that time, he would send an envoy to treat with whoever might be willing to talk. But if the Lannisters continued to harass them, the free folk would defend themselves and take what they must. When Brienne departed, Tormund's clan leaders murmured their doubts. Some wanted to keep pushing. Others saw wisdom in the temporary truce. Tormund silenced them with a roaring command. They would wait and see. If the Lannisters came to crush them, they would fight like cornered wolves. If not, perhaps there was a way forward that spared them all unnecessary bloodshed. At Casterly Rock, Cersei received Tormund's offer of a temporary cessation of major raids, relayed via cautious riders who had parleyed at the edges of the wildling camps. She snorted at the idea that these savages presumed to treat with her on equal footing. But something about the arrangement appealed to her cunning mind. Perhaps in that time, she could rally more troops or strike a deal with the North that would see Tormund's folk contained or destroyed without Lannister armies having to do all the work. She was also aware that further chaos could damage the already fragile economy of the Westerlands. So, grudgingly, she gave her men the order to stand down from large-scale attacks, though she allowed them to continue reconnaissance to keep track of the wildlings' movements. She penned a letter to Sansa Stark, insisting that if the North did not reign in Tormund, the Westerlands would handle the matter in a devastating manner. But there was a note of forced politeness, of pragmatic approach. Sansa, for her part, received word of the lull and breathed a cautious sigh of relief. She wrote to Jon Snow, urging him to come to Winterfell to help broker a solution. She wanted the presence of a man the wildlings respected. She also extended an invitation to Tyrion Lannister, who, as far as she knew, was still traveling as the hand to the Targaryen queen in King's Landing. Tyrion might have some sway over House Lannister, or at least help with negotiations. Above all, she wanted this conflict resolved with minimal carnage. The North had not asked for the free folk to invade the Westerlands, but neither did it relish the idea of a new wave of war. If a compromise could be reached, Sansa hoped to find it. Thus began a tense period of stalemate. Tormund's host occupied several farms and small villages, mostly in the northern reaches of the Westerlands. They foraged, they hunted, they tried to fortify themselves. The Lannister forces took up positions around them, blocking major roads and controlling key river crossings. Each side watched the other warily. Skirmishes still flared at times. Someone's temper would snap, or a foraging party would encounter a patrol. But by and large, the main confrontation remained on hold. Jon Snow arrived in Winterfell a fortnight later, traveling quickly with a small retinue. His hair was as dark and unruly as ever, threads of silver starting to show at his temples from the stress of the years. His face wore the strain of leadership he never wanted. Still, he embraced Sansa with warmth. They retreated to a private chamber where, over bread and salted fish, they discussed the crisis. Sansa laid out the situation plainly, her voice tinged with frustration. The northern lords were restless. They feared a potential Lannister reprisal if the wildlings were not contained. But they also remembered Jon's efforts to bring the free folk into the realm peacefully, and many wanted to honor that memory. Jon listened quietly, then asked for details of Tormund's grievances. Sansa explained how the gift had been ravaged, how the far north was still too harsh to farm effectively, how leftover tensions had made it impossible for many free folk to settle among the northern populace. Jon sighed, recalling how he had once dreamed that the union of the free folk and northerners would mend centuries of hatred. Perhaps he had been naive. That union was not as simple as signing a parchment. The war had ended, but old habits of mistrust lingered like a festering wound. Now Tormund was desperate, and so were his people. Sansa suggested a cunning plan: offer Tormund's folk a new home on disputed lands along the western border of the north, near the Neck or even in some lesser-inhabited swaths of the Riverlands. But that would require the cooperation of House Tully and others. More to the point, it might require some compensation to the Lannisters. Otherwise, they would never relinquish their claim to that border area. Perhaps the North could provide resources or negotiate a trade deal with Casterly Rock that made it worthwhile for them to cede some farmland. It was complicated, but if Jon or Tyrion could be the voice of reason, maybe it would work. Jon pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting a headache. He had no grand illusions about how easy it would be to persuade Tormund. The free folk wanted to choose their own land. But he also knew that Tormund respected him, might at least listen if Jon explained that a direct confrontation with the Lannisters would be disastrous. So, they agreed that Jon would travel west to meet Tormund in person, under a banner of truce. He would also send a raven to Tyrion in King's Landing, hoping to convene a negotiation at some neutral spot, perhaps Riverrun. Sansa insisted on dispatching some of her loyal soldiers with Jon, to ensure his safety, but also to lend weight to the argument that the North was serious about brokering peace. While these diplomatic gears began turning, Cersei's patience frayed. She paced in her solar, reading the latest reports. The wildlings were still in Westerlands territory, occupying farmland that should be paying taxes to her. Farms that produced wheat and barley were now feeding Tormund's savage lot. Cersei's treasury was thinning, her supporters grumbling. She wanted to crush them outright, but her generals advised caution. Gregor Clegane was long dead. The monstrous advantage she once possessed had vanished. Ser Robert Brax, the new commander of her forces, pointed out that the wildlings had no single city or fortress to besiege, making them hard to uproot entirely. He recommended playing along with the negotiations to buy time enough to muster more men from across the Westerlands, perhaps to forge new alliances with the Reach, or even to coax the Ironborn into harassing the North's coasts to keep them off balance. Cersei listened to all these suggestions, weaving them into her own dark tapestry of plans. She would appear to be cooperating in the negotiations, but if an opportunity arose to strike decisively, she would not hesitate. Weeks passed, and the uneasy calm held. Then came the day Tormund received word that Jon Snow had arrived at a neutral meeting ground near the border. A small meadow surrounded by a cluster of stunted oaks served as the site. Tormund approached with a handful of his most trusted lieutenants. They rode horses they had taken from local stables somewhat awkwardly. Tormund had never been much of a horseman, but he had learned a few things from the Southern War. When Jon Snow stepped into view, flanked by a few Stark bannermen, Tormund felt a surge of old camaraderie. He dismounted heavily, stumbling a bit, then pounded Jon on the shoulder in a gruff, warm gesture. "Good to see you, you gloomy crow," Tormund boomed. Jon for once smiled. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or scold Tormund. They quickly withdrew from the immediate hearing of their entourages. Jon studied Tormund's weather-beaten face. "You're risking a war that could destroy your people," he said quietly, with a note of sadness. "I understand why you're here, but this path leads to bloodshed." Tormund's eyes hardened. "We're already in bloodshed, Snow. Our children go hungry. Your lords won't have us. We wandered across half the north. Then we tried to find our place in the gift, but the land was spoiled. Maybe your sister means well, but she can't feed us or protect us from those who still call us savages. What are we to do? Just die quietly in the snow?" Jon shook his head. "No, but we have to find a solution that doesn't involve you occupying half the Westerlands. You know the Lannisters. They won't let this stand. Eventually they'll muster enough men to overwhelm you, or they'll make alliances that turn the rest of the realm against you. Even the North will be compelled to act." Tormund spat on the ground. "They can try. I've seen worse enemies in the undead. But I'm not so foolish as to think we can fight every Southerner at once." He shrugged, scanning the horizon where the Lannister lands stretched. "But if they would only give us land we can farm, raise our families. We're not monsters, no matter what they say." Jon placed a hand on Tormund's massive shoulder. "Let me talk to them. Let's arrange a summit with their envoys. Tyrion Lannister is no fool. He might persuade his sister, though she's as cunning and cruel as they come, that offering you farmland in the disputed border regions might be cheaper than a war. Meanwhile, the North and possibly the Riverlands can guarantee your good behavior. You would have to swear not to expand further south." Tormund laughed ruefully. "Swear? The free folk do not kneel easily." Then his laughter died, and he let out a sigh. "But if it spares my people from destruction, perhaps we can find a way. So long as we're truly free after, not beholden to any lord's whip." They spent hours discussing the details. Jon promised Tormund that if the Lannisters would not negotiate in good faith, The north would at least ensure Tormund's folk had a chance to withdraw safely. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. They parted with a sense of mutual respect, though tension lingered. Jon sent ravens to Winterfell and to Casterly Rock, proposing a summit at Riverrun. The Lord of Riverrun, Edmure Tully, was said to be somewhat pliable to the Starks, and the castle's position was central enough to be considered neutral. The invitation was extended to Tyrion Lannister on behalf of the crown and his house. It also welcomed any other relevant lords who wished to attend, as well as Tormund or his representatives. With winter starting to ease, the roads became passable enough for such a gathering. Cersei, upon reading Jon's message, nearly scoffed at the idea. Meeting Tormund's barbarian horde, as if they were a legitimate kingdom, offended her Lannister pride. But her advisors reminded her of the potential cost of a drawn-out war. Her subjects were weary of conflict. Her men had not fully recovered. Gold shipments from her once-rich mines had slowed to a trickle. She needed time to rebuild, time to secure new sources of revenue. A direct confrontation with Tormund might devolve into a guerrilla war that ground away at her armies. So, swallowing her anger, she agreed to send envoys to Riverrun. She did not plan to attend in person, but she would dispatch her newly minted hand, a lord named Roland Marbrand, an eloquent man from a loyal Lannister bannerman family, to represent her. Secretly, she instructed him to glean as much information as possible, to figure out the best moment to sabotage the negotiations if it suited her. But on the surface, she presented it as a genuine step toward peace. Tyrion received the summons in King's Landing. As Queen Daenerys' hand, he was torn. The Targaryen queen still sat the Iron Throne in name, though her hold over the Seven Kingdoms was tenuous, overshadowed by the Great Council that had placed heavy checks on her authority. Tyrion recognized that any conflict between the North and Westerlands would reverberate through the realm, undermining the fragile stability. He thought, ironically, that if he could negotiate peace between Tormund and his sister's domain, he might help unify the realm and strengthen Daenerys' position, or, at the very least, avoid more bloodshed. He decided to attend personally, reasoning that no one was better suited to deal with the Lannisters and the North than him. And perhaps, in the process, he could see his old friend Jaime, though Jaime had become reclusive, drifting away after the war, rumored to roam as a wandering knight. Tyrion had not seen Cersei in months. He wondered if she would truly cooperate or turn this into another of her traps. So the parties converged upon Riverrun. The ancient castle on the Red Fork of the Trident had changed hands many times in recent years, but now Edmure Tully ruled it again, albeit under the watchful eye of the new powers in King's Landing. The castle's wards, battered from previous sieges, were hastily patched up to host the summit. Banners of the Trout House Tully's sigil fluttered in a mild spring breeze. The moats and gates were carefully guarded, but the mood within the walls felt strangely hopeful. Perhaps the realm was finally learning to solve problems without swords. Jon Snow arrived first, with a small retinue of northern knights and officials. Sansa had stayed in Winterfell, trusting Jon's ability to handle this. Next came Tyrion, traveling by boat up the Trident from King's Landing, accompanied by a few royal guards in Targaryen colors and a handful of advisors. Edmure Tully welcomed them politely, though Tyrion noted the weariness behind Edmure's smile. The Riverlands had suffered more than most, passing from war to war over the last decade. Next came Lord Roland Marbrand, the Lannister envoy, leading a small retinue of men in crimson cloaks bearing the Golden Lion. Marbrand was a man of about 50, with thinning gray hair and a practiced politician's smile. He greeted Jon and Tyrion with courteous phrases, but made no secret that he represented Queen Cersei's interests above all else. Finally, Tormund Giantsbane arrived in a manner that turned every head. He was accompanied by a handful of wildling representatives, unarmored except for mismatched pieces of boiled leather and furs. Their weapons were sheathed, but more than a few castle guards eyed them nervously. Tormund boomed out a greeting, ignoring the stiff formality of the gathering. He clapped Tyrion on the back so hard that the imp nearly stumbled. Tyrion managed a bemused grin. He recalled Tormund from the war against the dead, but they had rarely exchanged words. Tormund's presence here was a testament to how bizarre the realm's politics had become. They convened in Riverrun's Great Hall, a once grand space that showed signs of hasty renovation. A large oaken table had been set up in the center, around which the negotiators took their seats. Jon Snow sat near the middle, representing the North's interests but also acting as a mediator. Tyrion took a seat opposite Lord Marbrand, representing the Targaryen crown in a broader sense but also with a personal stake in how the Lannisters proceeded. Tormund and his lieutenants took up one side of the table, looking a bit out of place. They had no fancy garments or sigils, only the rough clothes on their backs. But Tormund's chest was puffed with pride. He was determined not to be cowed by southern pomp. Marbrand spoke first, in a smooth tone. He thanked everyone for gathering to address the matter of wildling incursions into the Westerlands. He enumerated the damages to Lannister lands, the destroyed farms, the lost taxes. With a subtle shift of blame, he suggested that it was the responsibility of the North and the Targaryen crown to compensate House Lannister for those losses and ensure the wildlings were removed, one way or another. Tormund bristled, banging a calloused fist on the table. Remove us? We're not sacks of flour to be carted about. This land we took because your people left us to starve. Let that be clear as the sun. We're not here to line your pockets. Marbrand gave him a thin, condescending smile. I appreciate your perspective, but you occupy land that belongs by right to House Lannister. We have every reason to demand your withdrawal. Jon raised a hand to calm them. We're here to find a solution acceptable to all. Tormund's people need farmland. The Westerlands presumably have farmland to spare, though we understand the damage that war has caused. We have two potential avenues. The wildlings remain on a portion of Westerlands territory under certain conditions and pledges, or they withdraw to a region designated by the North, Crown, or Riverlands, with some measure of southern guarantee that they won't be persecuted. Tyrion nodded, steepling his fingers. The Crown would prefer a peaceful resolution. My queen has no interest in seeing the realm torn apart again by war. If House Lannister is willing to let a portion of farmland to the free folk, perhaps in exchange for some trade concessions from the North, that might be beneficial all around. Or, if Tormund's people withdraw, we must ensure they have lands that can sustain them without conflict. Marbrand sniffed, adjusting the folds of his rich cloak. You speak of farmland as though it's an endless resource. The Westerlands are not so bountiful that we can lose entire tracts to these new settlers. Our mines bring wealth, but our fields are precious. If we cede farmland, we weaken our own subjects. Then, turning to Jon, he added, but House Lannister recognizes that further war would also be costly. We might consider leasing land if we are properly compensated by the Crown or the North. Tormund listened, scowling at the term leasing. The wildlings were not used to the concept of paying rent to a southern lord. The notion offended him, but if it was the only way for his people to live in peace, he told himself he had to keep an open mind. Still, he could not keep the sneer from his lips. Jon cleared his throat. The North might be prepared to offer a portion of the goods we produce, timber, furs, or minerals from certain mines. We could create a trade agreement with the Westerlands that benefits both sides, to make up for farmland that Tormund's people would settle. This arrangement would be overseen by a joint council, ensuring the free folk abide by certain rules. He hated speaking so formally, but he recognized the necessity. Marbrand perked up at the mention of trade agreements. Timber would be useful, as the Lannisters do not have abundant forests. Furs, likewise, though we have some trade with the Iron Islands. Minerals might be considered, though we have our gold mines. If the North is prepared to send us a yearly tribute in exchange for farmland, it may be workable. But how do we ensure these wildlings do not expand further or raid our villages? Tormund's jaw tightened, but he spoke up. We're not looking to raid if we have what we need. You want us to stay in certain boundaries? Fine. We'll stay so long as the land is good, and so long as no one tries to push us around or tie us to your laws. We are the free folk. We'll keep our own ways. Marbrand nearly rolled his eyes. No one is exempt from the laws of the realm. If you dwell in the Westerlands, you must honor House Lannister's authority. Jon intervened before the two could erupt. We can find a compromise in terms of local governance. Perhaps the free folk can elect or appoint their own elders to manage their internal affairs, provided they recognize basic laws about not raiding other Westerland settlements. The real question is, which part of the Westerlands is best suited for them? We should choose a region with less population to minimize friction. Tyrion tapped his chin. There is an area near the edges of the crag, north of Lannisters, that's less cultivated. The soil can be decent if worked properly, though it's not prime farmland. Another possibility is the area near Case, but that's fairly populated. We need to find somewhere that won't cause immediate conflict with established lords. Marbrand said stiffly, some sections of the northern Westerlands, near the mountains, have been abandoned after the war. The farmland there might suffice, though it is quite close to the border with the Riverlands. We wouldn't want to cause friction with Lord Tully. Tormund scratched his beard. Mountains? We know mountains. Our people could adapt. He paused, as if uncertain how to proceed, then nodded. If that land can feed us, and you don't hound us at every turn, we might accept. Marbrand's lips thinned. In exchange for a yearly tribute of timber, plus a guarantee that no further expansions will be undertaken without Lannister consent. A long silence followed. Tormund stared at Marbrand with eyes like steel. We will not be caged. If the land can't feed us, or you keep pressing us, we'll do what we must. He glanced at Jon and Tyrion. But if we can live in peace, maybe we'll manage. Jon felt a flicker of hope. A framework was taking shape. They spent hours refining it. The North would facilitate shipping timber to Lannister ports, perhaps even help rebuild some of the villages the wildlings had destroyed. In return, House Lannister would officially grant Tormund and his folk the right to settle a specific region near the foothills. The Crown, as represented by Tyrion, would guarantee that neither side broke the agreement without significant cause. Tyrion carefully recorded the terms, skillful in the intricacies of forging pacts, citing precedents from various historical treaties. Tormund had little interest in all this formal scribbling, but he understood that the Southern Lords would never trust a handshake alone. He resolved to do what was best for his people, even if it meant stomaching Southern bureaucracy. After a fraught day, they adjourned. Everyone was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Tyrion invited Tormund, Jon, and Marbrand to join him for a small dinner. Tormund guffawed, saying he could eat an entire ox. Jon shot Tyrion an amused look, recalling how the imp always tried to keep matters civil over a shared meal. Marbrand politely declined, saying he had letters to write to Queen Cersei. So it was that Tyrion, Jon, and Tormund found themselves in a modest chamber of Riverrun, sharing roast duck, bread, cheese, and a cask of surprisingly good wine. Tormund demanded ale instead, draining tankard after tankard. Jon politely sipped water, explaining he wanted a clear head for the next day's final negotiations. You always were the brooding sort, Tormund teased. Drink up, Snow. Tomorrow we might be dead. You never know with these lion folk. Jon forced a half smile. I'm hoping that tomorrow we'll secure peace, not war. We've had enough dying. Tyrion raised his wine goblet. Here. My father once said that the only times you can truly be at ease in this realm are at a feast or in your grave. He may have been right. Here's hoping we can feast a while longer before the grave calls us. They clinked cups, an odd trio, the brooding northerner, the silver-tongued dwarf, and the boisterous wildling. Once mortal enemies, now forging alliances that might reshape the realm. After the meal, Tormund stumbled out into the courtyard to gaze at the unfamiliar southern stars. Jon and Tyrion spoke quietly, confiding their doubts. Tyrion admitted he did not trust Cersei to keep the deal if she saw a better opportunity. Jon nodded, saying that all they could do was secure as many guarantees as possible and hope that Tormund's settlement could defend itself if betrayal came. They parted ways, each lost in his own worries. The next day, as negotiations resumed, tensions flared anew. Marbrand had received a raven from Cersei, instructing him to add more conditions. The wildlings must provide not only timber but also a portion of their harvest for the first 2 years, to compensate for destroyed farmland. Tormund angrily refused, suspecting this was a scheme to starve his folk if the harvest was poor. Jon tried to mediate, suggesting a reduced portion or a postponement until they had enough surplus. Marbrand insisted on immediate compensation. For a moment, it seemed the entire agreement might collapse. Tormund threatened to leave, bellowing that the Lannisters sought to enslave them. Jon tried to calm him, while Tyrion hammered at Marbrand's logic, pointing out that an agreement that starved the wildlings was no agreement at all. Edmure Tully, who had mostly stayed out of the negotiations, quietly intervened. The Lord of Riverrun proposed a compromise. The free folk would provide a small share of their produce for the next 2 years, but only once they had established a stable harvest. If the harvest failed, the tribute would be waived until the following year, at which point the Crown or the North might step in with an alternative form of payment, perhaps small amounts of silver or iron. This way, House Lannister would still feel compensated without forcing the wildlings into famine. It was not a perfect solution, but after much arguing and table-thumping, Tormund grudgingly accepted, and Marbrand conceded the point. By midday, the terms were laid out in writing, each party reading and amending them. Tormund pressed a scarred thumb to the parchment in lieu of a signature, grumbling that he was no pen-pusher. Jon signed as witness for the North, Tyrion for the Crown, and Marbrand for the Westerlands. Edmure Tully also added his signature, affirming Riverrun as witness. The document spelled out that Tormund's host would relocate to the designated region near the foothills, not to exceed certain boundaries, with the allowance to farm, hunt, and manage their own internal affairs. House Lannister would refrain from hostility so long as the free folk did not raid or expand without permission. The North would send shipments of timber annually for the next 5 years, and the free folk would provide a portion of their harvest if their yields were strong. The Targaryen crown recognized the settlement as legitimate, guaranteeing that if House Lannister tried to renege without cause, the crown would intervene diplomatically. It was a fragile arrangement, resting on goodwill that was scarce in these kingdoms. But for now, it was better than war. When all was done, Tormund exhaled heavily, as though he had been in a wrestling match. He shook Jon's hand, then turned to Tyrion, giving him a curt nod. Didn't think I'd ever see the day where we hammered out deals with quills and parchments. But if it keeps my people alive, I'll stand by it. Tyrion offered a wry grin. I suspect in a generation, your people might be the best farmers in the Westerlands, telling tales of how they once lived beyond a wall of ice. The realm changes, sometimes for the better. Marbrand oversaw the formalities of sealing the parchment with the Lannister sigil. He was stiff but outwardly polite, though Tyrion suspected he was already plotting how Cersei might later manipulate this arrangement. For now, though, the handshake was made, the parchment sealed, and the war averted. Tormund's people left Riverrun the next morning, heading south and west with the official blessing of House Lannister. A few Lannister knights rode ahead, ensuring local lords complied with the decree. Jon accompanied them for a while, wanting to help them settle, to see for himself that the land was truly viable. They traveled along the foothills, the terrain rolling gently into a stretch of forest and meadow. Small streams cut through the valley. Ruined farmhouses dotted the landscape, remnants of the War of the Five Kings or later conflicts. The soil had lain fallow for years, and Tormund's clan leaders believed it could be turned to farmland again. They set about clearing debris, building shelters. Tormund roamed the area, marveling at how it was neither as harsh as the far north nor as crowded as he feared. He wondered if, in time, the free folk might even coexist with some of the local peasants. That remained to be seen. In the weeks that followed, more of the wildlings trickled south, leaving behind the battered fields around the Gift or the far north. For the first time, they had a recognized right to dwell in southern lands, albeit with conditions. Jon parted from them after ensuring the initial settlement was underway. He promised Tormund that if the Lannisters broke faith, he would ride to their defense if he could. Tormund clasped Jon's forearm in a fierce grip. You were always the strangest crow, Snow. Maybe now you'll come back to visit. Share some of that southern wine with us. Jon managed a small smile, though his heart was heavy. He knew how precarious this peace was. But for now, Tormund and his people had hope. That was a victory in itself. When Marbrand reported back to Cersei at Casterly Rock, she read the final terms. She kept her face impassive, but inwardly she seethed that so many concessions had been made. Still, she recognized the advantage. The wildlings were corralled in a far corner of her domain, watched closely by local lords. The arrangement gave the Lannisters a fresh influx of timber from the north, plus a share of harvest if it was abundant. She could bide her time, rebuild her strength, and if the day came that she wanted to reclaim that land, she might find a pretext. For the moment, it was convenient to appear as the gracious queen who avoided war. In King's Landing, Tyrion reported the settlement to Daenerys and the Great Council. He presented it as a testament to the crown's ability to maintain peace among the warring factions of Westeros. Some applauded, some grumbled that the crown had little direct authority over the free folk. But it was done. The realm would not bleed again so soon. Tyrion knew that was the best anyone could hope for. Over the following months, Tormund's settlement began to take shape. It wasn't easy. The wildlings were not expert farmers, though they had some among them who were adept at working the land. They clashed occasionally with Lannister tax collectors or local lords who tried to impose new demands. But by referring to the written treaty, Tormund's people could invoke the crown's guarantee or the North's promise. Word spread that House Stark would not tolerate wanton attacks on the free folk. That alone deterred many from picking fights. Gradually, shaky coexistence emerged. Some bolder free folk ventured into Lannister towns to trade furs or crafts for southern goods. And while tensions flared, violence was relatively contained. Jon visited the settlement once more before winter truly broke. He found that Tormund's folk had begun constructing log houses and small wooden palisades. Children ran around, chasing each other in the green grass, a sight that warmed Jon's heart. He and Tormund walked the perimeter, discussing the challenges that lay ahead. They talked of sending a few free folk youths to the north to learn more advanced farming techniques or blacksmithing. Tormund joked that soon they'd have a free folk city that would make Winterfell look like a pigsty. Jon shook his head with a smile, noting that at least Tormund hadn't lost his bravado. Still, the specter of Lannister betrayal loomed. Whenever Tormund's men hunted in the woods, Lannister scouts watched. Whenever a boundary dispute arose, Lannister riders approached in force. The official agreement stood, but Tormund was under no illusions. One day, the Lannisters might seek to push them out. That day, Tormund vowed they would be ready. His people had survived the worst winter in memory, had walked away from the edge of extinction against the dead. They would not be bowed by gold-cloaked men or silver-tongued envoys. But for the time being, a tenuous peace reigned. In the halls of Casterly Rock, Cersei plotted future maneuvers. In Winterfell, Sansa oversaw the shipments of timber that would soon flow south. She prayed that her trust in the process was not misplaced. Tyrion busied himself in King's Landing, carefully monitoring the situation, ready to intervene diplomatically if needed. So it was that Tormund Giantsbane's invasion of the Westerlands ended not in the blazing carnage many had feared, but in a strange alliance that reshaped the borders of the realm. The Lannister lion and the Stark wolf had found common cause, however fragile, to accommodate the free folk. A new chapter opened in the annals of Westeros, one where the lines between kingdoms blurred, and the once impassable boundaries of the north no longer defined friend and foe. The children of the free folk grew up beneath southern skies, learning a different sort of life than their parents, but still carrying the fierce spirit of freedom in their veins. The war drums quieted, at least for a while, and the battered realm took another halting step toward healing. Though watchful eyes remained on Tormund's foothills settlement, and the future was never certain, hope sprouted among the newly turned fields. For all the scars of the past, and all the cunning whispers in Cersei's court, the dream of living unbound by old hatreds flickered like a stubborn candle against the wind. Tormund Giantsbane, once a raider from beyond the wall, became the father of a new generation. Wildlings turned settlers, reminding Westeros that its wars and walls could not forever stand against the simple longing for a place to call home. And, for now, that was enough.